Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, starting in Chapter 5, page 80, The Reconstruction Period.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, Oni, from the Pro-Black Perspective and everyone else that's out there listening. I know that Sister Raw is listening with the elders. I know that the Daycare Ladies Network children are listening. I know that Jesse's kids are listening. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I know that The Forecast is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. I know that Afro Native is listening. I know Bawana Haguziki is listening. And I thank you. And Brother Bakari, I know that Brother Bakari is listening. Oh, and he's here. I hope everyone is having a great night tonight. Tonight we'll be talking about Chapter 5, The Reconstruction Period. The years from 1867 to 1878, I think, may be called the period of Reconstruction. This included the time that I spent as a student at Hampton and as a teacher at West Virginia. During the whole of the Reconstruction period, two ideas were constantly agitating the minds of colored people, or at least the minds of a large part of the race. One of these was the craze for Greek and Latin learning, and the other was a desire to hold office. It could not have been expected that a people who had spent generations in slavery, and before that generations in the darkest hedonism, could at first form any proper conception of what an education meant. In every part of the South, during the Reconstruction period, schools, both day and night, were filled to overflowing with people of all ages and all conditions, some being as far along in age as 60 and 70 years. The ambition to secure an education was most praiseworthy and encouraging. The idea, however, was too prevalent that as soon as one secured a little education, in some unexplainable way, he would be free from most of the hardships of the world, and at any rate, could live without manual labor. So here he's saying that just because you get an education doesn't mean you don't have to work. There was a further feeling that a knowledge, however little, of Greek and Latin languages would make one a very superior human being, something bordering almost on the supernatural. I remember the first colored man whom I saw who knew something about foreign languages impressed me at that time as being a man of all others to be envied. Naturally, most of our people who received some little education became teachers and preachers. While among these two classes, there were many capable, earnest, godly men and women, still a large portion took up preaching or teaching as an easy way to make a living. Many became teachers who could do little more than write their names. I remember there came into our neighborhood one of this class who was in search of a school to teach. And the question arose while he was there as to the shape of the earth and how he would teach the children concerning this subject. He explained his position in the matter by saying that he was prepared to teach that the earth was either flat or round, according to the preference of the majority of his patrons. So as you can see, they would get a little bit of education and they would think that they were ready to teach or preach. And these people came from all over with this same idea that they would be free from manual labor and not have to do any real hard work. The ministry was the profession that suffered most and still suffers, though there has been great improvement on account of not only ignorant, but in many cases, immoral men who claim that they were called to preach. In the earlier days of freedom, almost every colored man who learned to read would receive a call to preach within a few days after he began reading. At my home in West Virginia, the process of being called to the ministry was a very interesting one. Usually, the call came when the individual was sitting in church. Without warning, the one called would fall upon the floor as if struck by a bullet and would lie there for hours, speechless and motionless. Then the news would get spread through the whole neighborhood that this individual had received a call. If he were inclined to resist the summons, he would fall or be made to fall a second or even a third time. In the end, he always yielded to the call. While I wanted an education badly, I confess that in my youth, I had a fear that when I had learned to read and write well, I would receive one of these calls. But for some reason, my call never came. When we add the number of wholly ignorant men who preached or exhorted to that of those who possess something of an education, it can be seen at a glance that the supply of ministers was large. In fact, some time ago, I knew a certain church that had a total membership of about 200, and 18 of that number were ministers. But I repeat, in many communities in the South, the character of the ministry is being improved, and I believe that in the next 2 or 3 decades, a very large portion of the unworthy ones will have disappeared. The calls to preach, I am glad to say, are not nearly so numerous now as they were formerly, and the calls to some industrial occupation are growing more numerous. The improvement that has taken place in the character of teachers is even more marked than that in the case of ministers. During the whole of the Reconstruction period, our people throughout the South looked to the federal government for everything, much, very much as a child looks to its mother. This was not unnatural. The central government gave them freedom, and the whole nation had been enriched for more than 2 centuries by the labor of the Negro. Even as a youth and later in manhood, I had the feeling that it was cruelly wrong in the central government at the beginning of our freedom to fail to make some provision for the general education of our people in addition to what the states might do, so that the people would be better prepared for the duties of citizenship. It is easy to find fault, to remark what might have been done, and perhaps after all and under the circumstances, those in charge of the conduct of affairs did the only thing that could be done at the time. Still, I look back now over the entire period of our freedom. I cannot help feeling that it would have been wiser if some plan had been put into operation which would have made the possession of a certain amount of education or property or both a test for the exercise of the franchise, and a way provided by which this test should be made to apply honestly and squarely by both the white and black races. Though I was but a little more Though I was but little more than a youth during the period of Reconstruction, I had the feeling that mistakes were being made and that things could not remain in the condition that they were in very long. I felt that the Reconstruction policy, so far as it related to my race, was in large measure on a false foundation, was artificial and forced. In many cases, it seemed to me that the ignorance of my race was being used as a tool with which to help white men into office, and that there was an element in the North which wanted to punish the Southern white men by forcing the Negro into positions over the heads of Southern whites. I felt that the Negro would be the one to suffer for this in the end. Besides, the general political agitation drew the attention of our people away from the more fundamental matters of perfecting themselves in the industry as their doors and in securing property. The temptation to enter political life were so alluring that I came near to yielding to them at one time, but I was kept from doing so by the feeling that I would be helping in a more substantial way by assisting in laying the foundation of the race through a generous education of the hand, head, and heart. I saw colored men who were members of the state legislatures, and county offices who in some cases could not read nor write, and whose morals were as weak as their education. Not long ago, when passing the streets of a certain city in the South, I heard some brick masons calling out from the top of a two-story brick building on which they were working for the governor to hurry up and bring more bricks. Several times I heard the command, "Hurry up, governor, hurry up, governor." My curiosity was aroused to such an extent that I made an inquiry as to who the governor was, and I soon found that he was a colored man who at one time had held the position of lieutenant governor in his state. So as you can see, even though they were given high positions and they were elected into certain offices, they couldn't hold on to it because they didn't have the knowledge and the moral fortitude to hold on to those positions. But not all the colored people who were in office during Reconstruction were unworthy of their position by any means. Some of them, like the late Senator B.K. Bruce, Governor Pinchback, and many others, were strong, upright, useful men. Neither were all the class designated as carpetbaggers dishonorable men. Some of them, like ex-Governor Bullock of Georgia, were men of high character and usefulness. Of course, the colored people, so largely without education and wholly without experience in government, made tremendous mistakes, just as any people similarly situated would have done. Many of the Southern whites have a feeling that if the Negro is permitted to exercise his political rights now to any degree, the mistakes of the Reconstruction period will repeat themselves. I do not think this would be true because the Negro is much stronger and wiser than he was 35 years ago. And he is fast learning the lesson that he cannot afford to act in a manner that will alienate his Southern white neighbors from him. More and more, I am convinced that the final solution of the political end of our race problem will be for each state to find it necessary to change the law bearing upon the franchise, to make that law apply with absolute honesty and without opportunity for a double dealing or evasion to both races alike. Any other course, my daily observation in the South convinces me, will be unjust to the Negro, unjust to the white man, and unfair to the rest of the states in the Union, and will be like slavery, a sin that at some time we shall have to pay for. In the fall of 1878, after having taught school in Malden for 2 years, and after I had succeeded in preparing several of the young men and women, besides my two brothers, to enter the Hampton Institute, I decided to spend some months in study at Washington, D.C. I remained there for 8 months. I derived a great deal of benefit from the studies which I pursued, and I came into contact with some strong men and women. At the institution I attended, there was no industrial training given to the students, and I had an opportunity of comparing the influence of an institution with no industrial training with that of one like the Hampton Institute that emphasized industries. At this school, I found the students in most cases had more money, were better dressed, wore the latest style and manner of clothing, and in some cases were more brilliant mentally. At Hampton, it was a standing rule that while the institution would be responsible for securing someone to pay the tuition for the students, the men and women themselves must provide for their own board, books, clothing, and room wholly by work or partly by work and partly in cash. So even if you had the money to pay at Hampton, you still had to work off some of your debt. At the institution at which I now was, I found that a large portion of the students, by some means, had their personal expenses paid for them. At Hampton, the student was constantly making the effort through the industries to help himself, and that every effort was of immense value in character building. The students at the other schools seemed to be less self dependent. They seemed to give more attention to the mere outward appearance of things. In a word, they did not appear to me to be beginning at the bottom on a real solid foundation to the extent that they were at Hampton. They knew more about Latin and Greek when they left school, but they seemed to know less about life and its conditions as they would meet it at their homes. Having lived for a number of years in the midst of a comfortable surroundings, they were not as much inclined as the Hampton students to go into the country districts of the South, where there was little of comfort, to take up work for our people, and they were more inclined to yield to the temptation to become hotel waiters and Pullman car porters as their life work. During the time I was a student in Washington, the city was crowded with colored people, many of whom had recently come from the South. A large portion of these people had been drawn to Washington because they felt that they could lead a life of ease there. Others had secured minor government positions, and still another large class was there in hope of securing federal positions. A number of colored men, some of them very strong and brilliant, were in the House of Representatives at the time, and one, the Honorable B.K. Bruce, was in the Senate. All this tended to make Washington an attractive place for members of the colored race. Then, too, they knew that at all times they could have the protection of the law in the District of Columbia. The public schools in Washington for colored people were better than they were elsewhere. I took great interest in studying the life of our people there closely at that time. I found that while among them there was a large number of substantial, worthy citizens, there was also a superficiality about the life of a large class that greatly alarmed me. I saw young colored men who were not earning more than $4 a week spend $2 or more for a buggy on Sunday to ride up and down Pennsylvania Avenue in order that they might try to convince the world that they were worth thousands. Peacocking, y'all. I saw other young men who received $75 or $100 per month from the government who were in debt at the end of every month. I saw men who but a few months previous were members of Congress, then without employment and in poverty. Among a large class, there seemed to be a dependence upon the government for every conceivable thing. The members of this class had little ambition to create a position for themselves, but wanted the federal officials to create one for them. How many times I wished then, and have often wished since, that by some power of magic I might remove the great bulk of these people into the country districts and plant them upon the soil, upon the solid and never deceptive foundation of Mother Nature, wherein all nations and races that have ever succeeded have gotten their start. A start that at first may be slow and toilsome, but one that is nevertheless real. In Washington, I saw girls whose mothers were earning their living by laundrying. These girls were taught by their mothers in a rather crude circle, in a rather crude way, it is true, the industry of laundrying. Later, these girls entered the public schools and remained there perhaps 6 or 8 years. When the public school course was finally finished, they wanted more costly dresses, more costly hats and shoes, because they had been educated to be consumers even at that time. In a word, while their wants had been increased, their ability to supply their wants had not been increased in the same degree. On the other hand, their 6 or 8 years of book education had weaned them away from the occupation of their mothers. The result of this was in too many cases that the girls went to the bad. I often thought how much wiser it would have been to give these girls the same amount of mental training, and I favor any kind of training, whether in languages or mathematics, that gives strength and culture to the mind, but at the same time to give them the most thorough training in the latest and best methods of laundering and other kindred occupations. So as you can see, they've been tainting and messing with our educational system for a very long time, because they would take the girls away from the occupation of their mothers and put them in a place, in a position where they could be educated, but then when they came out of school, they didn't have any useful skill or occupation with which to take care of themselves, so they couldn't buy these beautiful dresses. Brother Bakari says in 2024, we are still begging them to do everything for us. We are still begging them to do everything for us. And unfortunately, we haven't learned the lesson that there is hard work that you have to do. You can't just be educated. You can't just have an education. You also have to have the character to put that education to good use. And unfortunately, that's something that they would never do. We have to do that work for our community. We have to talk to our young people. We have to give them the games, you know, instead of saying the game is to be sold, not told, making children learn in the school of hard knocks and putting them in a position where they create a vicious cycle of poverty in their lives. We have to pull them aside and give them the game and tell them, listen, you can go to trade school. You don't have to go and spend all your time in high school. You can start learning these trades that you want to learn when you're 14, 16 years old, if that's what you want to go into. You can teach them skills as young as 8 at the point that they aren't able, you know, to hurt themselves when they handle those big tools and things like that. If you know someone that has that skill, that's willing to spend time with the children, you know, we have to get them to the point where they're no longer the consumer class, but where they're the industrial class. That is the end of chapter 5. I thank each and every one of you for listening today. These are short chapters. Do you guys think I should read chapter 6? No? I want to thank the Pro Black Perspective, Oni, for being here, Anthony McPhail for being here, and Brother Bakari for being here. As I said, I know that Bwana Haguziki is listening, Sister Ra and the elders are listening, Koku is listening. I know that the children from the Daycare Ladies Network are listening, the children at Jesse's Kids are listening. You guys can do anything you want to do. You can do anything you want to do if you just ask the right people. Sometimes you have to ask a million people. You know, you might have to ask 5 people to help you learn how to do what you want to do. And it's okay because you might get no, but that one yes that you get will change everything around. That one yes that you get will change your whole life. All right. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I appreciate each and every one of you. Peace.